Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Axelrod.
Good morning. Excellent. It's good to see you all again. I feel like we've gone through this incredible journey together the last couple of days, and I think this last day is going to really bring home the whole purpose of this conference. I want to say that I heard a rumor that some of our panelists, as a delegation, visited some of Chicago's fine drinking establishments last night. It's just a rumor, and we're all about verification, so I'm just offering this. And I only say that to say there's lots of coffee out there, because some of them are on our panels today. You know, the credo, we're on a campus here, of a great university. We have some really distinguished academics with us, but I want to emphasize, this was never meant to be an academic conference. The credo of the Institute of Politics is inspiring thought, empowering action. We have had a lot of thought-provoking panels. Our goal is that when we leave here today, that we leave with a greater sense, not just of urgency, but of possibility, that we are inspired to take action and empowered to take action. And the last two panels today will deal with some of the official actions that can be taken to help deal with this challenge to our democracy and all democracies. The first two panels will, I think, speak to the urgency, even more so to why we have to take action. The first will deal with disinformation and political violence. The second will deal with disinformation and the threats to national security. And you know, we have just remarkable people on our rostrum today, on our program today. I will save the first panel for last, but I just want to mention that the second panel on Taming the Wild Wild Web will include Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is doing remarkable work on this subject in the Senate today. Former Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, who is the co-chair of the Future of Tech Commission, and they'll be in conversation with Kara Swisher, who needs no introduction to this group, the creator of Recode, columnist, podcaster, and most importantly, a beloved former fellow at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I think that's the thing that she's proudest of. I don't want to speak for her. On the Countering Disinformation's Threat to National Security panel, we'll have former Representative Will Hurd and current Representative Alyssa Slotkin, each of whom came out of the intelligence community and into elective office. So they bring a unique perspective, and they will be in conversation with Bart Gellman, who may be I think the most incisive writer in the country on these questions, and you can see his work in The Atlantic. If I didn't say that, I would have to face Jeff Goldberg afterwards, and he'd be angry about that. And then we're going to finish with a panel on imagining a better social media, and that will include Frances Haugen, who everyone knows. I'm sure she's sick of being referred to as whistleblower Frances Haugen, but what she really is a Paul Revere on this very urgent challenge. As is Ethan Zuckerman from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who's also carried this lantern for a long time. Cecilia Kang, the co-author of An Ugly Truth Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, who covers this issue for the New York Times. And Erin Simpson, and I just need to mention this. Erin is a fellow at the IOP this quarter. She is an expert on this subject at the Center for American Progress. It's the first time that we've had a student who began at the Institute of Politics 10 years ago come back as a fellow. And when you see her on this panel, you'll understand why. And we're just really, really proud of her and as a representative of all of our students. But let me introduce the first panel, targeted by lies, how disinformation spurs political violence. It will include Kathleen Belew, a professor here at the University of Chicago, who wrote a book in 2018 that got a lot of attention called Bring the War Home Inside the White Power Movement. And, give me the word. Kathleen, are you in the room? Where are you? What word am I missing? And paramilitary America. I can't read my own handwriting is the problem. This will not surprise my staff. Of course, Chris Krebs, who we all know, former director of cybersecurity of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and finally Adam Kinzinger, who is a representative from Illinois, who also needs no introduction. He's become famous, and I think deservedly so, for the courage that he's shown on issues of democracy, and that discussion will be moderated by Bart Gellman. Actually, Jeff Goldberg, you're moderating the discussion that I ascribed to. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Verification, fact checking on the spot. So with that, let me welcome this distinguished panel.
Good crew.
So in college, I never took the 9 o'clock class. So welcome to everyone and congratulations for making it. I wanted to start with you, Congressman, if I could, and ask you to talk a little bit about your own experience on January 6th.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, everybody. Good to see you. And Axelrod, good to see you. As you guys maybe know, you can never say no to David Axelrod if he gets his hooks in you. So it's good to be here. It's good to be with the panel. Chris is an absolute great dude and hero. As you guys find out about what he did leading up to the election, my wife worked, by the way, at DHS, and she was always talking about how great that CISA was run. So good to be with you, man. Real quick, so yeah, January 6th, look, I predicted violence on that day. It's actually interesting. Chris and I had a conversation prior to that where I just basically said, I think there's going to be violence on January 6th. I'm looking on the internet, I'm seeing these comments, some targeted at me. And by the way, if you convince, half of the country that the election was stolen, you should expect really nothing else, because the gist of our country was built on the fact that, you go vote, your vote is counted, and if in fact you're being oppressed by an oppressive government, you overthrow it. And so it's actually not a huge leap to think that there would be violence. So on January 6th, I had my staff stay home. I used to say I had my wife stay home, but now I say I asked my wife to stay home, but she did. And I actually went into work armed that day, and certainly I went out on the floor as the proceedings opened, and I decided to go back to my office and watch it. And by the time I was back there, I had heard that the outer perimeter of the Capitol had been breached. And then, over a period of the next hour or so, I end up finding out that, of course, everybody got into the Capitol. And I think the thing to keep in mind at that point is, once the Capitol complex is breached, there is really nothing to stop the entire complex from being overrun. That includes the office buildings. And I was in my office building, and we got the order to lock in place. And so I was alone in my office, again, armed, had the doors shut and locked, and actually had to entertain the idea that I may end up having to shoot some people that come into the office because, I'd been targeted on Twitter. And Anyway, you guys know how the rest of the day went, but I do want to make a quick point. At the end of the night, it was probably 3 a.m., we finally went out. You know, I gone on the floor actually when we finally took the votes, and people ask me all the time, when you went back on the floor, did you just feel like, oh, democracy is prevailing and this is great? And I'm like, yeah, eventually I got that feeling. Like, you know, it's great that democracy prevailed in the face of what happened. When I went on the floor, though, I was angry. I was furious. And I gave a speech in which I said, the emperor has no clothes, and I realized that the people behind me in my own party weren't applauding and were upset that I had said that. And I realized it was going to be a long next couple of years. And anyway, go home at 3:30 in the morning, and the thing that always sticks out to me, I'm a National Guardsman. We had spent that whole day waiting for the guard to come, and I saw actually my first guard troops as I was leaving at 3:30 in the morning, and that was an emotional moment for me as a guardsman myself. So yeah, it was a bad day. And but democracies aren't defined by bad days. They're defined by how they come back from bad days. And that's what's going to make the next few months or years even all the more important.
What made you predict ahead of time that there would be violence?
Oh, it's the easiest thing to predict. I mean, and I think Chris will tell you too, because he was watching what was going on. But you look in I guess it was Telegram channels. You look in even just right there on Twitter. Yeah, everything. And it was organizations that said, this is 1776. We had a congresswoman that tweeted, this is 1776 that morning. I don't know what else that means. But I remember seeing comments, because I was obviously very aggressive right after the election, even leading up to it. I had, one comment with a hangman's noose as a reply, and, Kinzinger, where's your office? We're coming for you. I don't know if I necessarily predicted that the Capitol would be breached and occupied, but I certainly knew there would be violence. I actually am surprised it wasn't widely predicted.
Well, I think it was. I mean, the indicators were there for some, but maybe the outcomes were different than were expected. My story that day is I was planning to relocate because I had seen some of the indicators. After I was fired and I did 60 Minutes, an attorney for the president went on TV or a show and said something to the effect that I needed to be given the traitor's punishment, right, drawn and quartered. And at that point, my death threats spiked. I mean, significant increase. And so I had armed guards in front of my house, 24/7 for 2 months. And I remember right around January 3rd that the management team from the security company said, hey, we're having some problems covering you on the 6th because all the businesses downtown in Washington, D.C. are asking for an increased security presence. So all the normal day-to-day guards that I had started shifting downtown. So they actually had to put managers out in the field. And so on January 6th, as we were at a family member's house, I had to run back home. And it was one of the most shocking, striking memories I have of the entire event, where I pull up to my house and there's a car in front of the house that I had never seen before, and it had a giant 3%er sticker on the back.
Oh, dude.
It was my security guard.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And it just shows you some of the overlap in terms of the extremist groups, as well as some of the folks that have some of the security training that we're relying upon.
What can historical context tell us, Madam Historian, about January 6th and the environment we've got now? How does it compare to other periods of political violence in our history?
I've been thinking about this throughout our conference, and especially yesterday on the other panel that you spoke on, Chris, about we've had a lot of remarks about, like, it seems like this has a longer scale. It seems like we might need some more long, deep context about what we're talking about, and not sort of in an intellectual references way, but there are real social movements that are pushing these things through. And I think history can tell us a lot about a central question of this conference that I think we have not adequately engaged, which is, we've said over and over some version of people want to know the truth, people want to know facts, people want to get good information, people don't want to be duped. one thing that history shows us, especially the history of some of the extremist groups that were involved in January 6th, is that for these activists, they simply have a different worldview and a different understanding of what that truth is than most of us in this room. And we don't see that only on the fringe. A lot of this is not, so historians might think about this less as disinformation and more as a problem of narrative construction, right? Worldview construction. It's motivated by sincerity. It's motivated by deep, earnest belief in many cases. And then it's also maliciously sort of manipulated by people who want, what did you say earlier? Power, money, and
Influence.
Influence. Power, money, and influence for their own purposes, many of whom are interested in overthrowing the United States, not to put too fine a point on it. And those folks on January 6th were able to use a combination of those sort of narrative constructions and worldviews and manipulation to push what happened. So I study neo-Nazis, Klansmen, skinheads, and militia groups from the late 1970s through the Oklahoma City bombing. And that earlier period really has a lot to tell us about what we're seeing now because, as you were saying earlier, out of this room, and as you just were talking about like we all know what happened on January 6th, we might, but we don't have a story about January 6th, not by a long shot. And part of the reason we don't is that the archive of information that gives us a wide view, that gives us not only what groups say they're doing, but what they're in fact doing, that gives us the relationship between people and actors, the sequence of events over time that begins to round out these questions about belief and sincerity, will not be available for this for, I would argue, at least 20 years. When we get people leaving the movement and testifying against compatriots and big court record declassifications and all kinds of things. And this might be different for you on the committee with your subpoena powers and your sort of access to classified documents that most of us don't have. But I still think wide view is very difficult to do in real time. When we have a historical cognate, there's a whole bunch that we can learn through comparative study, especially because this is the same movement that has been with us unbroken since the late 1970s. Same people, same organizing strategies, same worldview, same set of conspiracy theories, although we changed the language around the edges. So we know a lot about how belief works. We know a lot about what's a likely target. And there's a scene in the Turner Diaries, which is we can talk more about this if people would like to, but is a dystopian white power novel that came out in the late 1970s that describes an attack on the Capitol vividly similar to what we saw on January 6th. So this has been imagined over and over and over again, right? So we can triangulate the sort of intel gathering side, the sort of Twitter activity, the what are people doing that we see through surveillance agencies and police work and that set of tools. We can triangulate that with understanding the historical context and have a much, much more full picture of what's motivating and what's pushing. And I think that that is a critical piece of context for understanding and confronting the problem.
You made a distinction between disinformation and worldview construction. That sounded important. Say a little more about that.
So I guess, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm a word-defining person and because historians, disinformation is an uncomfortable word for me for a number of reasons. And part of it has to do with the definition that President Obama offered us on the first day about sort of this will to mislead. If you look at the way that, say, the white power movement leadership was disseminating ideas in the 1980s, they were trafficking in a set of things that we would understand as conspiracy theory, then called the Zionist occupational government, later called the New World Order. It has appeared under the name the Deep State recently, and then, accelerationism is basically the same thing under different sort
Chris
of
was a member
wide
of the
trapping.
Deep State, so he can tell you all about it.
Yeah, there you go. So, but the idea is that there is a cabal of elites that are in charge of a purposeful campaign to destroy the white race through a set of social issues that some of us might think of as capital C conservative, like opposing abortion, opposing immigration, opposing LGBT rights, opposing feminism, opposing women in the workplace, opposing residential integration. But for activists in this movement, that was all about this perceived threat to the reproduction of the white race. The people that were acting earnestly to deal with what they saw as an assault on their race, sometimes were manipulative and trying to use these ideas for particular purposes, but many times were acting sincerely and believed they had the truth and talked about awakening, right? That's not the same thing as, well, I mean, it gets back to what Maria Ressa was saying on day one about this is not something you can solve with facts, right? Because there's no fact you can tell to this particular worldview that wouldn't just affirm the entire project.
What are you seeing on the January 6th committee, Congressman, that that resonates with what Kathleen is talking about, the idea that white power is a significant factor in what happened on January 6th?
Well, I can't get into a lot of what we're seeing. There's a lot, obviously, that's out there in the media front. We'll be having hearings over the summer and ultimately a report. But that is one of the areas we're certainly looking at is we have basically 5 pillars of this investigation, everything from the Capitol posture to the president's actions, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the 3 percenters, First Amendment Praetorian, I always forget that word, Oath Keepers, all these kind of groups, that's a significant part of our investigation. Was it coordinated? What was done online? Is this something that just kind of popped up? Was it planned? Was it organized? Was it armed? What was the intention? I mean, some of the stuff that's out there publicly is, the Oath Keepers and some of those groups were under the belief that President Trump was going to declare the Insurrection Act and then basically take away the military and domestic law enforcement's authority, and under the Insurrection Act, he was going to actually put the 3 percenters and the Oath Keepers in charge of security of the Capitol. One of the things you were saying that I think is really important is you have to look at this, whether it's in counterterrorism, whether it's in any kind of, straight up warfare like we see in Russia, Ukraine. Everybody thinks they're the good guy. Everybody thinks they're the good guy. Al-Qaeda thinks they're the good guys. And so you have to look at it when you fight an enemy from the perspective of what is it that motivates them. And as was mentioned in their perspective, the fear is that this country is going to leave them behind. There are people that truly believe that those of us in government are into adrenochrome. Adrenochrome is when you bleed out babies and inject their blood so that you can be younger. They really believe this. They believe that we are Satan-worshiping pedophiles everywhere in government. And so while that is insane, we have to look at that and say they truly believe it. And so looking at these radical groups is an extremely important part of that in terms of what is their motivation. We have a lot of information. Obviously, DOJ's moved on some of this as well, and obviously look forward to putting that out in front of the American people. Because I think when it comes to the January 6th committee, it is essential to show you guys what we have, obviously, to play that story out. But I think our real audience is history. Because in 5 or 10 years, when my kid is in school and he's learning about January 6th, I want him to know the truth. I don't want there to be any shred of doubt that the FBI and Ray Epps somehow organized January 6th and an insurrection, or it was the deep state, or it was anything but what it was, which was a Trump-inspired insurrection. And that's what the important audience is in 5 or 10 years on this. And you talk about that perspective of history, right? And there were probably a lot more Richard Nixon supporters when Nixon resigned than there are today that, were actually Nixon supporters then. Everybody kind of denies it, right? I think the same thing will happen with Donald Trump, by the way. Everybody that's pretty super into Trump now in 10 years will tell their kids they never voted for the guy. But that's the goal here, is history actually is a lot faster than we think.
So may I just respond? There's one sort of attendant issue that we have to think about, which is the fact that Proud Boys and other groups that were involved on January 6th have made local school boards the front lines of this effort. Yeah. If we would like our kids to be able to learn history and to learn about the January 6th report, or to learn an account of the Civil War, to learn about why we needed an anti-lynching bill that we signed last week. I mean, those classroom spaces have to remain in focus as part of this set of information problems. And we've seen that, I'm from Colorado, we've seen sort of like school board targeting and attempts to degrade the study of history as a concerted strategy for a while, but the fever pitch that we're reaching around silencing history is, as a historian, especially concerning, but it should be concerning to everybody. I mean, this is, that's not a, well, anyhow, it's just something we should put on the list of, we keep talking about magic wands and wish lists of things we wish it could fix, and that's.
But then you have to get into the why.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bart, I'm gonna sidetrack here, but you have to get into the why, and I think from a historical perspective, the last 5 years probably, what happened? There was a significant shift in the permission structures that have now, what was 4 or 5 years ago was such a fringe edge movement, now has become almost mainstream. And a lot of the questions post January 6th, at least I was getting, is like, when should we expect the next attack on the Capitol? It's like, you missed the point. This established a high tide, and even if the tide recedes and it's happening at the state and local level, it's still massively problematic. And that is what I think we've seen, not necessarily political violence in the form of storming state capitals, but the way it's kind of infiltrated the political discourse, and we were not serious either in DC or in state capitals.
And the sanctity, by the way, of the U.S. Capitol was violated and will forever be that way. I know it's weird to say it that way, but it used to be kind of this almost religious experience to go to the U.S. Capitol, even when I worked there. And after that happened, then of course, after many in my party start denying whatever happened or cheapen it or say that it was a tourist, visit, it doesn't have the same feeling, and that's a frightening thing a little bit. It's part of that high watermark.
I think we have consensus here on the stage that January 6th was not an isolated incident, that it's part of a trend or a pattern. But I wonder if maybe starting with you, Chris, we could talk about where you see that going. Is it on the upswing? What are we in for more in the next election cycles?
Well, I think, as I said, the permission structure has shifted, and that's allowing a more permissive environment for political violence, for political speech that is not of the traditional, constructive manner. It's more of the 30-second sound bites on TV, and everybody's angling to get that little snippet that gets replayed on Twitter and Gab and Parler and Truth and all that other stuff. So where do I think it's going? I think to Kathleen's earlier point about how it's gotten down into the local school board level, the 22 election, and this was talked about a little bit yesterday. I think Mary McCord talked about this, and we talked about it on our panel yesterday as well. The 22 election is so important, but more, as I see it, at the statewide election level than for the House of Representatives. And specifically, I'm talking about Secretary of State races in Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. You have candidates from the Republican side that are active Stop the Stealers. Many of them have said they would not have certified the 2020 election. And once you get into that, if someone like that were to win in 22 and is in a position to be a certifying official of the 24 election, then you're kind of throwing the wheel out the window.
Yep.
And there's a significant amount of political risk involved here. And again, through whether it's disinformation or just broader alternative narrative constructions of fraud in the mail-in ballots or whatever you want to call it, that has a significant amount. That's where I'm concerned. You will lose confidence in the electoral process, and as David Axelrod was saying, the electoral process is the very fabric of America, and that is at risk of unraveling.
And I want to add to that. So democracy, the basic thing you need for democracy, by the way, democracy is the most difficult form of government. Having an authoritarian ruler is really easy, actually. You don't even have to work at it, right? You just live your life. They take care of all the hard stuff. Democracy is really difficult. The one thing we have to have for democracy to function, you and I, if you're on the far left and I'm on the right, kind of center right, I guess, not far right, but we could agree on nothing. But the one thing we have to agree on, is that our vote will count and that the results will be accurate, and that's it. Right? And then we use Washington, D.C., we argue words, we let the steam out of the violence, and we come to solutions. And the problem, as Chris was mentioning with, a Secretary of State, for instance, if Heiss wins in Georgia, if you have Georgia with the same thing, he refuses to certify the election. We've let the Constitution, and some of these actually unanswered questions of the Constitution, dictate how we count votes and how we go to a new government. If somebody is a wrench in that wheel, you have a constitutional crisis. I'll just end it with something like this. There is one unsung hero on January 6th. I mean, there's a lot of unsung heroes on January 6th, but one in particular is a clerk in the Senate that, as the Senate was evacuating, she remembered to grab the box of ballots that the state sent. Had the rioters gotten in, burned the ballots, stolen the ballots, otherwise destroyed them, the Electoral Count Act reads that you can't just say, well, I read in the paper that Georgia went for Biden. You have to have the actual certified ballot. So they would have had to go back to the states to send a certification ballot again, and you already know what they were talking about then. It wouldn't have happened, and we would have been thrown into a massive constitutional crisis. Certainly the Supreme Court would have stepped in and stopped it, but you can see how you continue down that road, and you ended up in a place where it is simply turning to violence is the only way to solve your problems, and that's scary.
Well, Congressman, take Chris's scenario of a election-denying Secretary of State in some critical state who refuses to certify the vote because the Democrat has won the next election. What happens then?
The Electoral Count Act doesn't, it's not clear. And that's why, sorry, I'm not the congressman,
please go.
But that is part of why there was a push over the last 6 months for clarification. Ben Ginsberg, a Republican political lawyer, really pushed for this as well, but we need clarification of who is the certifying authority in each state. Who should the Congress recognize on January 6th?
Yeah, that's where we need to have, one of the things I've been pushing for is Electoral Count Act reform. It's not as easy as it sounds. And I also need to be very clear, this is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet for the long term. This is a near-term thing to basically prevent something from happening in 24 because, the playbook has been run in 2020. They know how to maneuver now. And I'm not necessarily saying there's some grand conspiracy for 2024, but if we end up in the same position, but yeah, I think some of those things, absolutely through the Electoral Count Act, have to be defined and reformed. If you have somebody that simply refuses, there's got to be a role for it to be adjudicated in federal courts, right? Maybe federal courts come in within about a 2-week period and have to say yay or nay to any state that certifies. There's ways to do it, but that's essential.
Well, Supreme Court, with its increasing interest in the independent state legislature doctrine, might not go for the federal courts having a role in that.
Well, it would be in the law. It would be a law thing and not the courts. So the Electoral Count Act would basically, it's one of the things I've heard floated is basically in law it says that federal courts have to review certification. We'll see. We don't have, there's no bill yet. I'm just throwing these out there as ideas.
So I want to toss in something that's been on my mind. I've never much liked the term conspiracy theory because I think it dignifies fabrications with the idea of some scientific relevance. Theory is a science word. At a certain point, it starts off with someone just making stuff up, right? Why don't we start with a historical perspective here? Where do these things start?
So, you mean like particular conspiratorial worldviews?
Yeah.
Particular manipulations of our factual landscape? We should get, so I'm a historian of the 20th century, and my answer to you is I don't go back far enough to tell you adequately, right? So I can look at Zionist occupational government comes from Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which in the United States gets popular via Henry Ford and others in the 1920s, right? But before that, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is penned by people who are, my colleague Faith Hillis works on this, who are Russian immigrants to Paris who have their own sort of agenda that comes out of anti-Semitism in both of those countries that goes back for a much longer time, and old ideas about blood libel against Jewish populations, right? So I actually think that might not be the right question. I think the question should be, what do they do and what do they impact and why do they keep going, right? Like, what is it about that theory that grabs people? I was talking to Abby about this last night, about the Antarctica theory. Where did she go? I don't know. Hi, I'm fascinated. Like, what are they getting out of the idea of Antarctica? You know what I mean? Or like, why do they, in my research, I'm writing about Denver in my next book, so I ran into some of the Denver International Airport conspiracies, which Denver International Airport has just leaned into, and they're like, is this construction or lizard people, right? So, and please don't, if you're gonna put a clip of me on Twitter, please don't truncate that. But I mean, like, the point is that that story does something for people, and the ones that are widely successful do something for a lot of people, and the why is often a question we can get at by looking at other kinds of histories. What else is going on with American culture? What else is going on with our social makeup? What else is going on with the way that people's needs are and aren't being met in different facets of life? And usually people who turn to conspiratorial movements like the white power movement are echoing bigger shifts in American society. So white power groups that I study are interested in things like the apocalypse and the end times and nuclear warfare and a whole bunch of other fears that most everybody had in the late 20th century, right? So it's one manifestation of these bigger currents. And I think that one place that I find an antidote to a lot of these issues is the idea that that bigger current might be where we can create communities of trust and conversation. This idea that the nation is changing, right? So a lot of people are thinking about demographic change. It's just that the groups that I write about think about that as a war on the white population, whereas others are interested in, like, why do less people in my town speak English? Where did the jobs go that I believe I was entitled to because of the way that we talked about the mid-century moment of exception, the intense prosperity after World War II that we will very likely not return to. And that set of conversations could be bigger and could be more overt and could be around including instead of excluding. But to me, this all goes back to the classroom again, because the other thing that we don't teach anymore is civics. People don't know how elections work, right? So if you have a whole bunch of people storming the Capitol to protest how they think the election is rigged, who don't know how elections work, we have like the pre-bunking problem again, and we have an education problem, and we need a different tool set for these than a barrage of facts.
But election officials are not optimized for that sort of engagement.
Oh, no. This is high school classroom, I think.
So, right. I mean, when you make the point about people don't understand how elections work, they think they show up the morning, if they're not in a mail-in vote, you know, if they're not voting by mail, they vote that morning or whatever, then they turn on Fox or CNN or whatever, and they see the outcome, and that's it. Never minding the fact that there's months of preparation, including primaries, and then after the fact, there's canvassing, there's auditing, there's certification, then it goes up. I mean, it's a system of systems. We have to do a better job of educating and getting out of kind of the black box model. But I think, Bart, to your more specific point on 2020, where did those theories come from and how do we apply those going forward? If you look at the 2020 election, the stage was set probably in 2016 by the former president, but it really took off in the summer of 2020 with some of the COVID adjustments that election officials put in place and the shift to mail-in ballots. So in 2016, about 80% of voters had a paper ballot associated with their vote, and there were systems that you touch the screen and it gets recorded down on, the vote gets recorded down on removable media. We really worked aggressively over the 4 years between 16 and 20 to get Congress to allocate money and to get states like Georgia and Pennsylvania to get those systems out so that a vote cast would have a voter verifiable paper audit trail associated with it. And in part due to the shift to mail-in voting due to COVID, we went from about 80% across the country to 95%. Significant resilience measure, and that's how we were looking at it. Now the challenge is that shift to mail-in voting got picked up in the summer by the president, the former attorney general, and others as this is the highway to massive fraud. And so that set the expectation. And Kate Starbird, who's a researcher, disinformation researcher at University of Washington, and others, I think Joan Donovan's here as well, and they talk about this concept of participatory disinformation. And that starts trickling down, it hits the audience, and the audience is then primed and on the lookout for this kind of this mail-in. And then they see things that don't make sense, and they're like, aha, there it is. And then it swoops up to the influencers. And that, like, you know, there was the Disinfo Dirty Dozen for COVID, same thing went. There were super spreaders and influencers that would then push it out, it would get picked up in media. But what happened along the way, and this is where there was a bit of A/B testing in 2020, is you have this domestic fraud narrative that's building, and then late October comes along, and then people realize that there's opportunity for influence and money. The crazies come on board, and then boom, dead Venezuelan dictators, the Kraken, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, all about these narratives of foreign external, the Chinese, the Russians, the Venezuelans, the space aliens, all this other stuff that were manipulating ballots, and the foreign interference narrative spiked. The problem was they used both these fantastical concepts of Italian satellites beaming in, they used, again, the Venezuelan, the Hugo Chavez narrative, and it didn't resonate, and it was hard to describe. So it was both fantastical and technically complex and incoherent. And so from an A/B perspective, the foreign stuff didn't work. And even now, when you hear the narratives that are sticking on 2020, it's still about domestic fraud. It's still about the ballot mules and the harvesters. So I would expect going forward in 24 that you're going to see more domestic narratives than the foreign narratives, because they've proven that the foreign narratives are really hard to hit mainstream, assuming you're trying to convince anyone of anything, which is not necessarily always the case in disinfo more broadly. Sometimes the point is just to flood the zone and lose perspective and truth.
I think that tells the story of Stop the Steal and Dominion voting machines and that kind of set of narratives, right? But I think the other part that we have to keep in view is the smaller group of extremist activists like Oath Keepers, Praetorians, Proud Boys, and the folks that were on the 6th, the most highly organized, the most militarized, the people with advanced plans, the people who are connected with one another. And you know, this was clear from the footage from the jump, and the subpoena information seems to be confirming this now, unless you know something I don't know. But those folks are trafficking in conspiracy worldviews that go back way farther. And they've been hanging out just waiting for an opportunity. So the way I teach this to my undergraduates is that the Klan and the white power movement and sort of the different manifestations of this, they come and go through American history. They change forms quite a bit, but they're always opportunistic. They're always interested in kind of parachuting into the local context, tacking on to whatever local tension is available and whatever cultural forms are possible and popular, right? Which is why we see the tropical print shirt coming into view at a particular moment. Or, you know, you can go back to the 20s and look at the very fashionable ladies' Klan robes. It's the same thing in a different moment. That's about just figuring out a window of opportunity for the thing they want to do anyway, which is recruitment, radicalization, and attack on the United States. Because white nationalism, the word we always use, we often forget that the nation in white nationalism is not the United States, it's the Aryan nation. They're interested in overthrow of the United States and fundamental reorganization of an all-white ethno-state. And I'm just saying that so we're all clear. I mean, so this is not all of January 6th protesters by any stretch, and it would be a big mistake to paint everybody with the same brush. But we have to pay attention to that subgroup. And the reason is that that subgroup is, first of all, I don't think at all conclusively oriented towards only pursuing electoral mechanisms of any kind, although certainly they're doing that. There is also a huge ongoing threat of mass violence and ongoing attacks on vulnerable communities, including communities of color, women, LGBT communities, trans communities, it goes on and on. So we have to keep in mind the fatalities alongside our concern for preserving democracy. I think these are twin parts of the same problem.
But I'll just say real quick on that, a part of the reason disinformation can work so well is everybody has to fight for something. That includes all of us up here. That includes all of you out there. You always want a cause you fight for. You want to be kind of the hero of the story. You want to fight injustice. And that's why I think conspiracy theories can spread so fast, is because if the CIA was attacked by DOD in Germany, that was one, by the way, you know, if there is really this deep, dark government conspiracy going on and you have the information, you have the truth, it triggers that, like, fight for justice button.
Tribalism.
Yep, and that is something that we could do a whole hour on tribalism too, but I think, too, that is just something that I don't have the answer to, but as we think about how to disinfect disinformation, it's like in civics education, how can you convince people that actually going to vote is fighting for something big, or, getting back to that.
You spoke earlier of disinformation as something that the consequence of it is violence. That if you believe it's 1776, if you believe that an evil cabal has stolen an election, then violence is actually the logical response. But I wonder about the relationship between disinformation and violence, whether you think violence is actually the purpose of this disinformation, that the disinformation is constructed in order to justify violence.
Possibly. Chris may be better to answer this than me. And in my view, I kind of see sometimes disinformation as not even an organized thing. It's different actors in many cases in 2020 that either created a narrative or kind of went off another narrative. It became viral. It kind of grew. And I'm not sure if violence was the end goal. I think the outcome of we're going to stay in power, or we're going to, create, in essence, an army of people that now buy into their tribe. They recognize that I can't go out now and deal with these other people, so I just have to be a member of this tribe. And that's actually something that's really frightening to me is, in the long run, we don't have the ability to disagree with each other anymore, much less, right and left don't have, sane arguments about disagreements anymore. But now within the movement of the right, which I'm familiar with, if you are for some version of gun control and you're a member of an anti-gun control group, you're going to be kicked out of that group. So everybody becomes monolithic thinkers. So I don't know if violence is the end state. Maybe it is.
It depends on your objective, I think. Again, to the power, influence, money. 3 objectives of information disorder and campaigns in general. If your objective is power, then yes, one way to do it is you identify the issue, you activate the accounts, you get things moving, you start amplifying, you hit it mainstream. And so I think January 2020, from a political disinformation power construct, was entirely predictable. Yeah. Again, you saw the stage being set in 2016, but 2020 for practical purposes, and it all built up. I mean, I just think you talked about radicalization earlier. The radicalization had been happening. The activation happened in December of 2019. The "it will be wild" tweet, that's an activation. Mm-hmm. Proud Boys, stand back, stand by. Mm-hmm. That was an activation. And giving them, within that shifted permission structure construct, the outlet and the encouragement, and then pointing, it was all there. Now, if you're just talking about money, no, not necessarily. If your outcome is money, some of the COVID fraudsters that were, shopping around alternative therapies, no, they just want the grip, they want the money. And even now, I think some of your colleagues are not in it for violence or money; they're in it for influence.
They don't believe any of the stuff.
They want that. They want the Twitter exposure. They want to get kicked off Twitter. Because that's a good opportunity to continue building the brand.
Instant fame. Yeah. You can get instant fame now in politics.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So think of your questions now. Robert Pape, who's here at the University of Chicago, has done some very interesting polling, and he finds that there are about 6% of Americans who believe both that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president who was not elected to the office, and that violence is justified to restore Trump to power. It's a small percentage, but a large number of people. It correlates to about 20 million Americans. And his view is that this is just a massive dry kindling, waiting for the next spark. So I'd ask any of you who want to say if you agree with that and what you think the next spark might be. What would be the precipitating event?
So the only kind of qualifier I'll put on this is that I think every president going back for decades has been, by some small subset, considered illegitimate. Trump was considered illegitimate because of the Russian interference. Obama was considered illegitimate because he was not, he was born in Kenya, or whatever the theory was. So that's always been there. The difference now, to your point, is again, I'll say it, broken record, the permission structures have shifted, and now political violence, in part because 2016 or January 6th, and people have not necessarily been fully punished yet. It looks like a trial run. It looks like it was a mulligan. It was a free shot, a practice run. Do it again.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's take it to the floor. Adrian.
I can just be loud. Congressman, sorry. Right here. Thank you so much for doing this. Congressman, question for you. I know you talked about the January 6th committee's work being done with history in mind, but I'm also wondering, especially given the sense of sort of this clock ticking toward the next election and the strike kindling that you mentioned, have you considered making more of the committee's work public along the way? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of it's getting out, right? You guys see this all the time. We have a lot of leaks on the committee, but I think basically it's all going to be public in the summer. And there's an art between, if you constantly have new information that comes out every day or every week, people tune it out, and it becomes like the frog boiling in the water, right? You don't even notice the changes. I mean, just yesterday or 2 days ago, Donald Trump said something crazy. I don't even remember what it was. A couple months ago, he admitted to basically doing a coup and asking, Mike Pence to not certify the election. And it's like, wow, this should be huge news. But people are like, it's Donald Trump. So, but you will see all the information that we have this summer. And that'll be, again, through a series of hearings, which may be over a week or 2 weeks, and then ultimately in the report.
It's hard for me to see here. There's someone here in the center.
Hi, my name's Sophie Hare. I'm an undergraduate here in the college. I have a question just about educating the public about how to read through misinformation and disinformation. It's very easy to be duped online. I certainly fell for a lot of the narratives on Twitter about Ukraine very early on. Speaking to your point, Professor Belew, about the necessity of a high school civics education, is there any other education that you think is necessary?
There's so much education that's necessary. Look, I'm a historian, and I know that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I really think that if you think about Make America Great Again, that is a historical argument. That is asking us to think about when that is referring to, whether it was great, can we go back again, who's we, what's America? That is an argument. I think we need to engage it as a historical argument. So I think that history can offer us a ton of tools for thinking through these problems. One of them is that history has a ton of contingency in it. Things didn't have to turn out the way that they did. Like, yes, we can predict, we can go back and look, but there's all kinds of moments where history offers us a set of things that didn't happen, that could have happened, that might happen in the future. And so I think historical education at every level, but especially I think upper middle school and high school level, is critical for kind of expanding the menu of possibilities in action that might happen in the future. I think it's incredibly important.
The mic on here? Yeah.
I don't know if this, there it's working. Hi, my name's Spencer. I'm a second year at the policy school. I had a question that was touched on earlier about narratives of apocalypse and things like that, and thinking about the title of this talk, How Disinformation Spurs Political Violence. I almost wonder if the title should be How Existentialism Spurs Political Violence. When you see existentialism on both sides of the spectrum, climate change on the left and some of the things you talked about on the right, is it possible to avoid political violence in an age where both sides think kind of it's the end of days, end of the world? Thank you.
I'll just say it real quick. I personally think it is possible. I'm actually optimistic long on America on this question, because in my mind, if you look back to a really bad time, about 100 years ago in American history, pre-World War II, there was bad leadership in the country, obviously bad economy, et cetera. And out of that, social movements arose. And within 1 year, I think you had the Kiwanis, Future Farmers of America, Alcoholics Anonymous, these kind of groups that came up screaming because there was no leadership, and they provided the leadership. I foresee that in the future in this country. And I think if Washington, D.C. continues to be performance-based and not serious, I think the American people will demand different and demand better. And so I don't think violence is inevitable. I think the American people will, and this isn't just me being all, politician, the American people stuff. I truly believe that they will demand better of it, and they will throw out the politicians, or they'll provide the leadership necessary. There may be more violence. I don't think it's inevitable, though.
One other thing that it gets overlooked, I think, is the contributing factor of COVID to the acceleration of disinformation and extremism over the last several years, where people got pulled out of their community and had to sit at home or whatever it was. Like going to a kid's soccer game and saying, hey, did you hear that JFK Jr. is going to be Trump's running mate in 2024? Normally, in the pre-COVID days, I would be like, you're absolutely insane. But you go on to a Facebook group or whatever, and you say that you're in a community of interest, and that those echo chambers build up. So I think as we reemerge from COVID, God willing, that you will see some of that acceleration and radicalization ebb. To your point, I hope.
I do too.
I think that might be true. Can I add something about the apocalypse? Because this is kind of, are any of my apocalypse students here? We did a class last year on the way that people have imagined the apocalypse over American history, because this is not new to us. I mean, we have arguably a series of more pressing apocalyptic threats right now that maybe not arguably. I'm taking back the arguably. Anyway, pressing apocalyptic threats wherever you're sitting on the political spectrum. But the interesting thing about apocalypse stories is that they're actually about survival. They're about adaptation and how people adapt after the end, how people come together and form new communities of disaster, how people reach out to each other across those divides. So I think actually there's something very hopeful in that frame, should we decide to locate it.
Sunny side of apocalypse. Got the mic over here.
Hey, good morning. I'm Ali Nurani, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the rise of Christian nationalism in the context of January 6th, but not only to kind of obviously the negative side of that, but also what's the role of churches in terms of mitigating the rise of nationalism? Because you've talked about schools, but obviously churches play such a big role in all this.
I want to answer this as a Christian myself. It's very concerning. There are a number of churches that have basically become, from a house of worship of Christ and of God to a house of worship of Donald Trump. And if I look in the what I believe in the New Testament and the words of Jesus, it was all about not being involved in government. There's nothing wrong with being involved in government, but not living your life obsessed with it. It's about humans. And I think the church played a huge role in how we got to where we are. I say the church generically. And I think the church will have to play a huge leadership role in getting us out of this moment. We need pastors, we need priests, we need leaders who are going to stand up in front of the pulpit and say, we welcome Democrats in this audience as well, and we're not going to sit here and worship Donald Trump because he's a very flawed man. In fact, all men are flawed. Instead, we're going to talk about what matters, which is human souls, and government, you go do your own thing when it comes to government.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have.
There you go.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panel.
Thanks, guys. All right.